All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. He is Peter Myers, who is a professional engineer, and he actually also holds a master's degree in education. So he has an education background as well. It's quite a unique background. Peter has over 30 years of experience in leading project teams. He's experienced in a whole bunch of industries, including manufacturing, oil and gas, pipelines, petrochemical, commercial, and industrial construction. I actually watched this, Peter's, a few months ago, this presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and I really thought that the members may enjoy it as well. So that's why we're bringing it for you today. Peter's a very experienced facilitator and also storyteller with a passion for the underdog. He's a passionate educator who uses his life experience to add context and meaning to his stories. Peter is also the author of the business book entitled Accountable, an inspirational approach to re-engage your people and achieve greater success. All right, everybody, put your hands together for Peter Myers.
Wow, it's windy out here today. Hi, and welcome. My name's Pete Myers. I'm going to be your guide in the race to the South Pole. You and your team will be joining me for the most extreme challenge ever undertaken by man or woman as we follow the 1911 expeditions of Norwegian Roald Amundson and Brit Robert Scott as they seek to be the first man to reach the South Pole. But I need to ask you something really important before we go. Are you and your team ready? Do you have the resilience you'll need to persevere harsh conditions and demanding workloads? Do you have the speed to get the work done and the agility to adapt to changes? Are you and your people in top shape, confident, committed to meet the customer's needs no matter what? If you're ready, this is going to be an epic experience that you'll cherish the rest of your life. But if you're not, it's going to be a long, cold, tough slog. Today, I'm going to share a revolutionary lean framework for improving the quality and efficiency of your execution teams that is based on one simple concept: accountability. I'll also be sharing my groundbreaking accountability index, a new analytical tool that is based on the 7 key enablers of improved accountability. We'll use the tool to analyze the preparations of the two teams to see who has set themselves up for greater accountability and greater success. I believe a tale from our past that allows us to directly compare the two leadership styles serves as a critical reminder of why we need to be better leaders, setting our people up for success, and believing in their ability to execute regardless of how extreme our challenge might be. I'm going to head into the base camp where it's a little bit warmer, and we'll get this started.
Whoa, it is cold out there today. As mentioned, my name is Pete Myers, and I will be your guide on the race to the South Pole. As Mark mentioned, thank you for the introduction, Mark. I'm an engineer, I'm an educator, leadership consultant, but I've spent most of my career as a project manager, leading diverse teams of craftsmen and experts in the execution of a wide range of projects in many, many industries. And when I look back at my career, I can say that almost every project was deemed a success, but too many of those successes seemed like a long, hard, cold slog. We always got done what we set out to do, but it just seemed to be more, often harder, more chaotic, more toxic than it needed to be. It seemed we were successful despite ourselves. But I knew there was a better way, a way that gets better results without all the pain and suffering and losses. Then on one project, I was able to do things differently. I implemented my accountability framework that I had been working on. I spent a lot of time getting clarity on purpose, on responsibilities, on the customer's needs, and on our execution plan. I implemented a team development process to drive cohesion, collaboration, and fun. We threw away processes that didn't work, and we redeveloped them so that they did. We took ownership of our responsibilities, and we committed to the client to meet their needs no matter what. And as a leader of equals, I imposed one rule for my team, that my team members, not their managers, had to make the decisions related to their deliverables and their tasks on my project. I had noticed on previous projects, many of the external managers often thought that they were the ones responsible for making decisions on the team, and it resulted in a lot of problems and a lot of chaos. All too often, those decisions were not in the best interest of the client. That project was not without its challenges, and it certainly wasn't without its conflict, especially with those external managers trying to micromanage their people. But we were successful because of ourselves. I felt very proud and vindicated on that project. It was a tremendous success on all fronts. We had really moved the needle on how projects are executed, and we had an empowered workforce that was more collaborative, more respectful, and more accountable. On subsequent projects, I wasn't able to lead in the same way, and I couldn't convince my leaders that there was a better way to lead. I didn't know how to communicate that to them. But I knew there was a better way because I'd done it. Then I came across the story of the race to the South Pole, the true story of the two teams that raced head-to-head to be the first to set foot on the South Pole. The two teams had dramatically different leadership styles, and the head-to-head comparison proved that my approach got the job done more consistently, with less drama and fewer losses. I want to share that story with you today because I think it's critical that our organizations become more efficient, more innovative, and more profitable, or they simply will not survive. At the turn of the 19th century, no one had broken through the icy barrier to Antarctica to be the first person to even set foot on the continent. So there's little understanding of the continent's geography, geology, biology, and weather, other than it was damn cold. Antarctica is the highest, driest, windiest continent on the planet. And it is definitely a continent of extremes. It has open lava lakes, and it's got a desert where it hasn't snowed in 200 years. It's the fifth largest continent in the world. It's bigger than Europe, smaller than South America. And the name Antarctica means opposite of Arctic. Hey, isn't that, some committee must have came up with that one. Temperatures in Antarctica average minus 28 in the summer and minus 58 C in the winter. The lowest temperature ever recorded is 89.6, and the highest temperature ever recorded was 20 degrees C, and that was actually just last year. The ice in Antarctica, the highest wind speed ever recorded was 327 kilometers an hour. That's 80 kilometers an hour faster than a Class 5 hurricane. The ice in Antarctica is on average 2 kilometers thick. It's said to contain 90% of the world's freshwater supply in that ice cap on Antarctica. Now, if we could come up with a way to melt that ice and release Antarctica from that frozen tomb, we would uncover an amazing continent that has lakes greater than the Great Lakes, canyons grander than the Grand Canyons, and mountain peaks that rise over 16,000 feet. The year was 1910, and the world was in the middle of the age of heroic polar exploration. Robert Peary of the U.S. Navy had just captured the North Pole, and that left the South Pole as the last place on Earth that man had never been to. And to get there would not only be a true test of leadership it would be a true test of human endurance and leadership in 3 parts. Those parts would include the planning before leaving the voyage to Antarctica, and then the actual trip to the pole. Our 2 opponents are Roald Amundson, a Norwegian mariner, and Robert Falcon Scott, the British naval officer. The race for the South Pole was documented day by day in the journals of both leaders as they strived for the same goal. And as such, it serves as an incredible head-to-head case study that we can not only analyze their ability to achieve their goals, but the way in which they did it. There'd be many challenges on this journey, and I've listed them here. The first one is really team safety. Just like today, safety is number one. We want to get our teams home, our men home safely, men and women home safely. And so I'll be tracking the team safety stats as we go through the race. Team cohesion is really critical. They're going to spend 2 years in tight quarters, and they need to be able to get along. So that was a really critical part for both leaders to understand. Planning logistics, obviously, if you haven't figured it out before you've left for Antarctica, it's going to be pretty tough to improvise once you get there. And then the last key challenges are logistics and the last challenge is navigation. And not so much at sea, because these guys were competent sailors, but once they actually got to the land and had to navigate to the South Pole, it is critical that the teams have effective navigation to ensure, one, they don't get lost, two, they can find their food, and three, they can actually confirm that they made it to the South Pole. In 1908, British Navy Captain James Cook was denied his claim to the North Pole due to his team's inability to actually locate it. So let's take a closer look at the teams. Robert Falcon Scott had joined the Navy at age 15. He had spent time all around the world before getting noticed for winning a squadron race that just happened to have the president of the Royal Geographic Society in attendance. A few years later, at the age of 33, a chance encounter with the president led him to offering Scott the Discovery Expedition to Antarctica in 1901 to 1903. Scott was not committed to the challenges of polar exploration, but he knew in times of peace, it was the only way he could move up the ranks in the Navy. So he accepted. The Discovery Expedition was hailed a tremendous success, making key geological and biological discoveries, as well as attaining the furthest south record of 82 degrees, 17 minutes. Despite the successes, Scott's leadership style was disastrous, almost killing the entire Polar Party because of his poor decisions. They were successful despite themselves. Scott would be considered a top-down leader in which loyalty, hierarchy, and rank were critical elements in how the organization functioned. And all communication had to go through proper channels, which meant through him. But he was also extremely insecure and was often threatened by the leadership of his second command. He threw his second command, Ernest Shackleton, under the bus after the Discovery Expedition, blaming its errors and screw-ups on him. Scott would accept no accountability for his own decisions. In 1909, the Royal Geographic Society committed to another expedition, so naturally Scott was their choice. Amundsen was driven by a keen sense of curiosity and adventure. As a youth, he had read Sir John Franklin's narratives of his overland Arctic expeditions and had been enthralled by the North ever since. He would be considered a leader of equals. That's someone who comes into the room not to give orders, but to assign responsibilities, provide clarity of purpose and expectations, and inspire their team to achieve greatness. Equally important is their commitment to use their skill, knowledge, experience, and influence to take down the barriers to their team's success. His communication style was open to input, ideas, and feedback, and he was honest and transparent with his men. In order to make plans inclusive and build necessary buy-in, he hung maps of the expedition plans in the ship with a note on it saying for all to use. His expedition was privately funded, and he invested everything he had, including mortgaging his house and selling all his assets. He was committed, but he was also given more control over the expedition with fewer stakeholders to please and compromises to make, as was the case with Scott. Amundsen had an impressive polar exploration resume as well. He wintered in Antarctica in 1897 or 1897 to 1898 as the first mate on a Belgian Antarctic expedition. He then attained his captain's license, and from 1903 to 1906, he and a small crew of 6 men were the first to sail the Northwest Passage. During this time, he learned the ways of the Inuit people, their food, their clothing, and their transportation. A shipmate once described Amundsen as the biggest, strongest, bravest, and generally best dressed for sudden emergencies. Initially, Amundsen had intended to be the first to the North Pole. However, when Robert Peary claimed that just before setting sail for the expedition, he made a clandestine plan to head to the South Pole instead. He told no one but his brother, his confidant, and his first mate. He's pretty good at keeping a secret considering his open communication style. When they made their first and only stop on the way to Antarctica, he told the men of the change of plans, and he offered any man a return trip to Norway if they did not want to join him on the race to the South Pole. The men all knew that being the first to the South Pole was better than being the second to the North Pole, and they all enthusiastically agreed. Looking at the teams, Scott, so that's his team with the blue box, and that's Scott in the middle. He had picked all men that he had previous journeys with, and he was assured of their loyalty and their willingness to follow his commands. But the remaining crew of 60 men were hired from 8,000 applicants with no polar experience and little thought given to team competency or cohesion. The Norwegians, on the other hand, went with a smaller team of 19 men. That's all 19 of them in the picture with the red box. All but one were Amundsen's personal choices, but he knew he had personalities to be compatible in that 2-year expedition. He knew that was one of the most critical things he could do when choosing his team. They were also individual experts and would take on specific roles and responsibilities on the voyage and on land. One role he did not hire was a doctor or a dentist. He seemed to have something against doctors, although he had spent time in medical school. Instead, he sent one of his men on a lightning course in dentistry and surgery. So I'm really hoping you don't have a need for either of those when you're in Antarctica. The two leaders would take two very different approaches to clothing. Amundsen would go with traditional clothing of the Inuit people, what was proven, and copying the animal skins and the way that they functioned. Scott would go with state-of-the-art high-tech gear, which was more breathable and could be layered as required. This is the basis for all modern polar exploration equipment or clothing. Scott's ship, in the blue box again, was a Terra Nova. It was a 3-mast, wooden-hulled Newfoundland sealer. It was 187 feet long, 31 feet wide, with a 19-foot draft, and a cargo capacity of 764 tons. It was powered by a 140 horsepower steam engine, and the ship had been hastily refurbished and not been tested prior to departure, including defects such as a bilge pump, which was known to fail when you needed it most. Amundsen's ship, the ship on the left, it was a 3-masted schooner. It was custom designed for polar exploration with its ability to withstand the crushing forces of pack ice. It was 127 feet long, 33-foot beam, and only a 15-foot draft with a cargo capacity of 400 tons. But it was powered by a 180 horsepower diesel engine. At the time, diesel engines were new technology at the time, and Amundsen knew that the diesel engine would be critical in his ability to maneuver in pack ice. Amundsen sent the Fram and its captain on a test voyage to Greenland to pick up their sled dogs that they would be using for the trip and to make sure all systems on the ship were functional. When Fram departed Norway, Amundsen was on board, not as captain. He was a certified ship's captain, but he had hired a captain and he delegated authority to him for the entire voyage. While on the ship, Amundsen spent much of his time discussing his plans with his men. He also brought 3,000 books to ensure the men were intellectually stimulated, and he brought a phonograph for fun. Terra Nova, it departed Wales without Scott, as he took a passenger ship to South Africa where he would meet his crew, and he immediately would take over as captain. He had not fully developed his plans for the pole and did not involve his men or officers in their development. Scott also brought books and a phonograph, but they were reserved for the officers. Amundsen had sent his dog handler to personally select the 100 Greenland Huskies that would take them to the pole, while the ship's captain tested out those retrofits, and you can see a picture of the sled dogs there. The man on the right is Private Oates. He was the horse handler for the British, and his name really was Private Oates. He was supposed to go to Siberia to pick the ponies, but for some reason didn't or couldn't, so they sent someone else. And then when he eventually saw the horses, when they loaded them in New Zealand, he referred to them as crocs. So there's no accountability there. Once at base camp, Scott established separate quarters for officers and enlisted men. He tended to keep to himself, and he shared his plans only with his officers. Scott's plans for the actual pole expedition were not revealed to his team until only a few weeks before they were set to depart. Amundsen, on the other hand, set up communal quarters and with no segregation. He laid out all his plans and maps for all to review and provide their own input. Food is an amazing aspect of the race to the South Pole, and what this slide shows is the actual daily rations per man. This is what they would have to consume. And Scott, what he did is he calculated, how much food did each man need for the worst case scenario of 6 months, how much food per day, and that's how much food he brought. Amundsen did the same thing, except he multiplied that number by 5. Both men had experienced a loss of cooking fuel on previous polar expeditions. No one really understood why. They would store fuel and then they go to use it and the can would be almost empty. So what Amundsen did is he soldered the lids on the cans to prevent any evaporation. And he also brought 5 times more fuel than he thought he needed. Scott didn't either. The Norwegians redesigned ski bindings. They needed something that would handle the extreme terrain on the climb and the descent of the Transantarctic mountains. And that design that Amundsen came up with is still the basis of the current 3-point boot system in skis today. The Norwegians also invented a new tent. They wanted something that they could set up faster, so it was designed with one pole, and the way it was built, it would withstand wind much better. The Norwegians also mounted a mariner's compass on the back of the sled so that they could navigate in real time. So someone on skis would ski, kind of by the compass, and they could tell which direction they were going in. The Brits would have to stop and take compass readings on a regular basis. The Norwegians used a marking system for their food depots that is used in cross-country ski races. It consisted of flags going basically 1 kilometer in either direction, east and west of the food depot, and then flags for a couple hundred kilometers leading into the depot itself, making it very easy to find. The Norwegians also created a canister system to make unloading and loading the sleds easier, because they knew they didn't want to be spending time after a hard day on the trail and then having to unload all their sleds. They created cheat sheets for simpler navigation to minimize errors when they were under stress. There's just countless examples of where the Norwegian team were solving problems that the British team didn't even seem to know that they had. They took the necessary precautions to ensure that no uncontrollable risk would be the cause of their demise. The top-down British team did not. They didn't even know the mistakes that they were making. The first C is culture. So culture is our ability to execute or not. If culture is not empowering with decision-making authority aligned with task authority, your execution network is not robust and you'll likely break down under stress. What are some of the things that Amundsen did to establish his culture? Well, he empowered individuals to take ownership of their responsibilities. He relied on collective wisdom. He used group planning, and he promoted individual leadership. Scott, on the other hand, he ensured his team were loyal and would just follow his orders. And then he relied almost exclusively on his own wisdom and leadership. I have this quote from Richard Branson on the cover of my new book. And I really like it because it really speaks to the importance of believing in our people. Sadly, in a survey in France only a few years ago, 4% of executives actually did believe in their people. The other 96% believed their people were lazy, stupid, and incompetent. Okay, there's the rest of my C's. I'll just go through them one at a time. The first one is clarity. Clarity of purpose, of responsibilities, of processes, of scope, and of schedule. Clarity is often free, but really focused on when launching a venture and having a transaction at the organizational level. But clarity is the foundation to ensure everyone is pulling in the same direction on your team. So again, Amundsen, he used things like shared maps, collaboratively developing those plans, and each man having their own area of responsibility to gain clarity. With Scott, he had very little clarity. He shared very little. He just gave orders, and people were expected to follow. Collaboration is the next C, and collaboration is obviously the willingness and support of the team to work together for a common goal, right? And for Amundsen, he traveled with his men. He did things like have music, so they would have fun and they would, enjoy their trip together. They did the shared planning. They had the roles and responsibility cleared, and they even did stuff like they ate together. And Amundsen actually had opportunities for the men to work together, but also for the men to work apart, because he knew that part of collaboration is not always being with the same team, but maybe getting a break from that team sometimes. Scott also had the music and books, but they were for officers only. The enlisted men's mess hall, this is an interesting point. I don't know if it's about collaboration, but the enlisted men's mess hall where they ate was below the stables for the horses. So when it was rainy or wet on the upper deck, it was pretty ugly eating dinner. Scott marveled throughout his journal about the men's resilience and their lack of complaints. The next C is commitment. Commitment is taking ownership of responsibilities and stepping up when things go wrong, right? Amundsen got clarity, or he got commitment from his team. He gave them the chance to leave when he told them they had changed their plans to go to the South Pole. He leveraged Norwegian pride. They were a new country. They had just established their independence from Sweden, and he used that to get commitment. He had those responsibilities were individual responsibilities, but they were given the green light to be innovative. And Amundsen was really a kind of leader that you would die for. Scott, on the other hand, he got through commitment through loyal and committed Navy men. That's just, they had to be committed because they're a Navy man. And Scott, I would describe as a leader that they would die with as opposed to die for. The next C is communication. And I'm always shocked by how little communication happens in project teams and how little happened with the British team. Again, Amundsen did a great job of communicating by being active with his team. The next C is competency. We saw how Amundsen made sure that each role was filled by someone who was competent in that role, and the importance of having that competency. And then the last C is controls. And these are the tools that measure, provide feedback, and sometimes automatically adjust for errors across execution. Control should provide organizational leaders with insights to monitor progress and troubleshoot problems and facilitate decisions. So you can look at the Norwegian team, and they had a number of controls, little things like the compass, soldering those cans, even sharing the plans is a control in itself because people understand the plans better. Scott's controls were not nearly as robust as those of the Norwegian team. All right. Now, I also mentioned that I've developed something called the Accountability Index. This is an analytical tool that you can use to analyze your teams. It measures your team's efficiency and effectiveness. It predicts your team's efficiency and effectiveness. It's based on those 7 key enablers of accountability, and it's a online survey that takes about 15 minutes to complete. Results can also be broken down, so you end up with a spider web that shows you where you rated. I don't know what our culture score was, but it's probably a little bit higher than what is shown here. Let's take a look. You can also break this down if you want to look at your team, demographics, geographical region, by department, however you want to break it down, you can, and then that's a valuable tool to share best practices. Now, I've also used the tool to analyze the 2 teams, and using their preparations and my understanding of it to then do the accountability index and predict who was going to be the winner. And you can see from the results, I've given the Norwegian team a score of 63 out of 70, and the British team a score of 39 out of 70. These results don't say that the British won't be the first to the South Pole. They could win despite themselves. But it does tell us that their team is not as effective or efficient as the Norwegians, and they'll therefore experience higher losses even if they do win the race. So let's set sail and begin the race. The British ship Terra Nova departed from Cardiff, Wales in early June 1910 with a crew of 65 men. The ship would sail to South Africa, pick up Scott, and then carry on to Melbourne, Australia, and Auckland, New Zealand, where they would pick up the last of their supplies, including the Siberian ponies and the sled dogs. En route to the Terra Nova would hit near hurricane conditions. She was seriously overloaded and top heavy, and the bilge pumps failed as expected. So the men were left to bail by hand. Luckily, they were able to make it. They survived and were able to make it to Antarctica. And I put up their safety stats. So we had 66 near misses. We had 11 their first aids. We had 2 lost time injuries and 0 fatalities on the trip. The Norwegians left Oslo in probably about six weeks after the British had left, and they took a different route down the coast of South America and would arrive in Antarctica only 1 week after the British, and covered only 20,000 kilometers compared to the 30,000 kilometers the British had to sail. Okay, so let's take a look at where they are and what their routes are to the South Pole. You can see the British would take the route pioneered by Shackleton, and so it was pretty well mapped out, and they knew exactly where they were going. It would be 800 miles one way or 1,300 kilometers one way. The British or the Norwegians, on the other hand, their camp was 600 miles closer to the pole, so their round trip distance was reduced by 1,200 kilometers. Significant advantage for the Norwegians. The Norwegians had a fairly simple strategy to get to the pole. They'd use dog sleds that would take them all the way to the pole with 8 men on cross-country skis. Scott's plan was much more convoluted. He would have 3 different teams departing from the base camp. The first team would be the horses. They do much of the heavy hauling. The second team were the dogs. Scott didn't like dogs, but he brought them anyhow to help the horses. And Scott also had an ace up his sleeve. He had something that they called the motor sledges. The motor sledges are more a precursor to a tank than a snowmobile, but these motor sledges could travel across the barrier at twice the speed of a man on foot. Once they got to the mountains, the horses would be slaughtered. The dogs would then go back to the base camp, and they'd be left. The men would be left man hauling sleds up the 10,000 foot elevation of the Transantarctic Mountains. Once they got to the top of the mountains, 12 men of the 12 men who went up the mountains, 8 would go back, 4 would carry on to the pole. Very confusing. In the early months of 1911, before winter's grip set in, the Norwegian team set up 3 depots containing 3 tons of supplies for the journey, which would take as long as 6 months. Let me say that again. 3 tons of supplies for 8 men. The British, on the other hand, they would set up 1 depot with only 1 ton of supplies for 19 men. The depot was to be at 80 degrees latitude, but the horses were struggling, and Scott did not want to push them anyhow, so they ended up about 35 kilometers short of that 80-degree mark. The teams would then settle in to their respective base camps to wait out the frigid Arctic winter. In September, the days started to get longer and the weather started to warm up, so Amundsen decided to change plans and leave early. He knew about the British motor sledges, and he was worried that would give them too much of an advantage. But after only 3 days on the trail, they ran into minus 50 weather and had to hunker down and retreat back to their base camp with their tails between their legs and clear descent among the Norwegians. So again, I'll update their safety stats. In the British camp, Scott had wanted to settle a score with his nemesis, Ernest Shackleton. So he sent 4 men, including the second command, on a side trip in very harsh conditions. And again, 3 of the men were injured, severe frostbite. 1 had a concussion, and they too had open descent in their team. All right, so let's get this race started. Okay, first, before we go, let's give those Norwegians that 60-mile head start. And the Norwegians have changed their plans. They'll now be traveling with 5 men from the base camp all the way to the pole. The British will stay with their original plan. Finally, on October 19, 1911, the Norwegians were ready to start. And they're off under perfect conditions on a race to the South Pole, and skiing 6 to 6.5 hours per day and covering 12 to 30 miles. The Norwegians look like they're on a ski vacation. 10 days later, the British horses are off, followed by the dogs and the motor sledges. The horses are struggling, but look at those motor sledges go, baby. The Norwegians are still strong and steady, but the motor sledges are closing fast. Wait a minute. There's a problem. Looks like both motor sledges are out of the race. The Norwegians make it through the Trans-Antarctic Mountains with only a few near misses, and after 2 months on the trail are the winners. All right, I hope you liked my Carney voice on that one. The Norwegians arrived at the South Pole on December 14th, 1911. They erected a cairn to commemorate the event. They spent 3 days confirming their location and planted another cairn at what they believed to be the closer spot to the pole, which was about 2 miles away. The Brits were slogging almost 10.5 hours per day and only covering 10 to 15 miles, working much harder than the Norwegians. The horses continued to struggle, and they had forgotten to bring snowshoes for the horses, although they were on the ship. Once the British team hit the mountains and before they started their climb, the horses were slaughtered, the dogs went back. But Scott, interestingly, made Lieutenant Evans give up his skis to the returning party. This was part of Scott's plan to wear Evans down so he wouldn't be even capable of making it to the South Pole and be on the polar team. The Norwegians, on the other hand, have lightened their sleds, and they're heading home with well-marked food depots all the way. Once the British team reached the top of the Beardmore Glacier, Lieutenant Evans was in really bad shape, and Scott decided to send him back with the returning team. But rather than replace him with 1 man, he replaced it with 2. So now they had 5 men going to the pole, but they only had rations for 4. Finally, on November 17th, the British team spotted the Norwegian flag and the cairn that had been erected at the site. Dejected, Scott would write in his journal, "The pole, yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without reward of priority. It is something to have got here, I suppose." Of the 5 men who were sent, only 1 was a navigator, and they really didn't confirm that they had reached the South Pole. They only made it to the cairn, the first cairn of the Norwegians, so they actually didn't make it to the pole. Scott and his men turned north with almost 800 miles to base camp. Private Evans, no relation to Lieutenant Evans, struggled across the high plateau with several slips and falls. By the time he got to the bottom of the glacier, he collapsed and died. 6 days later, with encouragement from Scott, Oates, who had lost all function of feet and hands from frostbite, left the tent and did not return. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers struggled on to a point 11 miles south of the British depot, but were halted on March 20th by a fierce blizzard. That's 24 miles past where the depot was supposed to be placed. The men were unable to move on further, and they hunkered down in the tent until they died. If you looked at Scott and his team's accomplishments in isolation, you would say that they were successful. They reached the South Pole and they paid the ultimate price. Like, we build monuments for heroism such as this. But when you look at them in parallel and compare them to how the Norwegians did, you look at the mistakes and the errors and the screw-ups and the loss of life associated with that top-down leadership style, it becomes increasingly obvious that the more inspired, team-based leadership model drives higher degrees of ownership and accountability and gets the results without the losses. And with that, I'd like to close with a quote from Roald Amundson. "Victory awaits those who have everything in order. People call it luck. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take the necessary precautions in time. That is called bad luck. As a leader, you can never be ready for everything, but as a team leader that focuses on accountability, your people can if you let them. I'd like to dedicate today's webinar to the 5 men who lost their lives so that I could tell this story. In 2018, 1,027 Canadians and 162 Albertans died on the job. How many of those could have been prevented with better accountability and better leadership? I'd also like to recognize the 5 Norwegians who made it to the South Pole. Left to right, we've got Sverre Hassel, Oscar Wisting, Roald Amundson, Olav Olafsson Bjaaland, and Hilma Hansen. They're looking pretty good considering they just got off the land for 4 months. Sometimes in our culture, there's too much appreciation for suffering and not enough appreciation for leaders who get the job done efficiently and effectively. What kind of leader are you? So I want to leave you with three takeaways. One is that an accountable workforce is a high-performance workforce. An accountable culture requires decision-making authority to be aligned with task authority, and improving the 7 key enablers of accountability will improve performance and results. And my one ask is, if you like the seminar today, please share it with your friends, send them an email, post it on social media, and send me a note. Let me know what you thought of it. If I piqued your interest about polar exploration, there's lots of books out there that you can pick up and read, including many of the ones that I use for references in this seminar. There's also another book I can recommend, and that's my book, Accountable, and it's available on Amazon. You can go to my website, and there's a link there, or you can call me, and if you're looking for to buy one for your whole team, I can give you a bulk discount.
So thank you for your time today. I hope I've inspired some of you to focus more on accountability, and I hope that the 7 C's will be a simple tool that you can use to drive better interactions and more effective execution teams. Now, can you remember the 7 C's? Culture, clarity, collaboration, commitment, communication, competency, and controls. If you need some help navigating and implementing the 7 C's, definitely give me a call or drop me an email. Remember, if what you're doing is important, can you afford to have a disengaged team that ignores controllable risks? Get the most value out of your team today by implementing the 7 C's of accountability in everything you do. Thank you and have a great day. Stay accountable.